So welcome back to another episode of Explain Yourself. This time we have Heather, who is another grad student at Northern Illinois University with me. And you are a doctoral student,
yes,
right? So can you give us like the short and sweet elevator pitch for your current research?
So I work with grassland birds, and I look at their nest and how their nests are succeeding. So whether or not there's a chick in there, does it leave the nest or does it not? And I'm looking at how that's changing with the recent bison reintroduction. It's a big thing here in Illinois since they haven't been here for 150 years. So I'm looking to see if those grassland birds are doing better or worse with this recent reintroduction.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's something that we talked a little bit about with my research. So you do your stuff at the same sites, but looking at different organisms.
Yep.
Yeah, but the prairie is super important. And why specifically do we care about the birds in the prairie? So
birds, grassland birds specifically, are in decline, mostly due to habitat loss. We don't have a lot of prairie left, less than 1% in Illinois, about 4% in the United States. So we don't have a lot left, so they're in decline. So we really want to make sure our management doesn't impact them anymore. So reintroducing the bison could be detrimental to them, it could be beneficial, but we don't know, and we want to make sure that they are.
Great, okay, nice. And have you discovered any effects so far that you're able to share?
No.
No.
But that's a good thing.
Okay.
So my study is probably one of the first, and I think it's one of the first done, recent reintroduction. So right when bison are reintroduced, a lot of other studies are looking at the effects of bison after they've been present for decades. So they've been there for a while, their effects have accumulated. Mm-hmm. So right now, within the last 3 years that I've looked at, there isn't a difference. I have one more year left, and I always say it like I'm going to find more things with that 1 year, but it'd be great to see what happens and maybe get that shift if there is going to be an effect by bison, see when that could happen.
Nice. Okay, so you have been doing your sampling since the bison were first put back in Naturalist.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Nice. And so I think that the methods that Heather uses are really fascinating and fun. So could you explain to us how you go about testing for these effects?
So first I have to find nests to see whether or not bison are impacting them, and I equate that to finding a needle in a haystack. The needle ends up flying towards your face when you're close, so that makes it easier to find. So grassland bird nests are pretty small. They're about the size of a CD, if anybody remembers CDs.
Okay.
That's how they're very small. They're hidden in all this tall grass. Mm-hmm. The one way to find them is to just walk through all of my sites, trying to flush the parent off, and again, it's like that needle flying towards your face.
Okay, so the mother will fly up?
Yeah, the parent will fly up, so it can be female or male depending on the species. So they don't leave the nest unless they know that threat is real. So it usually happens when my foot's next to them. When they definitely are for sure this threat is real, I need to leave. And it's pretty jarring experience for those who haven't done it before, especially if you get larger birds like pheasants, or even mallards or mourning doves. It could be very
you found
jarring
ducks
experience.
In the prairie.
There were ducks in the prairie, yes. So when you do flush them off, I take all the data I need from that. So number of eggs or chicks, whether or not it was parasitized by brown-headed cowbirds. And these are birds that don't build nests of their own. They don't have parental care, but they flock around bison and livestock and lay their eggs in other species' nest. So I need to go through and make sure it is parasitized or not, because that could be detrimental in its own right to that species. But once I write down all that stuff, I GPS it and I move on, finding another nest. And I follow that nest through time to see whether or not a chick leaves the nest and it's successful, or if it was depredated or abandoned or anything, and no chicks leave the nest and it's unsuccessful.
So you can tell whether or not the brown-headed cowbird has laid an egg in that nest because the eggs are very different visually.
The eggs look different, the chicks look different. You can definitely tell the difference, especially when they parasitize sparrow nests. Sparrow eggs are a lot smaller and they look a lot different. Yeah.
Sure. So I know a little bit about this, but for anybody who doesn't, can you explain more to us about how that works? If the eggs and the chicks look different than the bird that's supposed to be in that nest, why do the parents allow it to stay?
So most of the time they don't, and they will abandon the nest because there's extra eggs in it. They know they didn't lay those eggs. They don't want to be responsible for those eggs, so they abandon the nest. hopefully the next nest they build is not parasitized by the cowbird. But when the parent doesn't abandon the nest, it will raise those cowbird chicks as its own. It doesn't really notice a difference between the two. And unfortunately, sometimes they feed the cowbird exclusively because it is larger than the other chicks in the nest, even though that they're their own chicks. Yeah. It's louder, it's bigger. They're like, this one seems to be more successful or bigger. I'm going to feed it more than my other chicks, and that's really bad for them too.
So yeah, they're a bummer.
Yeah.
Okay, so nest isn't parasitized, but you also talked about depredation. So what are we looking at in terms of other risks for the birds out there?
There are a lot of different nest predators to grassland bird nests, but mostly small mammals. And you can think of raccoons being a big nest predator, but not in a prairie system. So they're usually found in the forested habitat. So our main predator are small mammals like mice and voles. They tend to go and find the nest. We also have snakes. So the bird has to try to conceal their nest as much as they can away from this predation risk as much as possible, both from terrestrial, like I mentioned, and from aerial predators, because hawks and crows especially are big nest predators.
Sure.
Yeah.
And some of those, I would assume, are more predators of the eggs and some are more predators of the chicks, or does everybody kind of do both?
It's pretty much both. I haven't seen any difference between them, but early on in the nesting cycle, when it is just eggs, they're more likely to be depredated than when there are chicks there. I think a lot of that has to do with the parent being present or not, and just ease of being able to get to those eggs or chicks.
Nice.
Yeah.
And you did a cool experiment with the predators and some fake eggs, which I also thought was really fascinating. So can you walk us through how you set that up and what you were looking at?
Yeah, so not only am I looking at real nest on the prairie, I'm putting out artificial nest in the prairie, and I do my best to mimic a bird in making these nests, but it's the best I can do, and it's better than buying them. A lot of people buy artificial nests. So what I do is I build a nest and I try to make them look like a dick sisal nest. It's with chicken wire and with prairie grass I've collected from Nachusa wrapped around in it. I stick these out at my sites at Nachusa. I put quail eggs in as bait to make it seem like a nest, at least smell like a nest. There are a lot of things I can't mimic and I wish I could. And then I put clay eggs in there as well. So like I mentioned, they're small mammals coming to these nests. They can't bite through the quail eggs, and quail eggs are just smaller than a chicken egg, but bigger than a normal egg out there.
So it doesn't fit in their mouth?
So it doesn't fit in their mouth. You could see the scratch marks from their teeth, but they can't get through it. So they end up going to the clay eggs, even though they don't smell like eggs at all, and they bite through those clay eggs, trying to get to what I can equate to the juicy center that they're going for, and they do it until they realize that there isn't anything there. And I put them out for a normal incubation time, about 12 days, and then I go back and I collect all these eggs and look at those teeth marks on the clay eggs and identify the species that depredated it.
Interesting. Yeah, so you've got, and this is, I guess, more typical of a doctoral project, that it's multiple projects all sort of centered around the same theme, whereas those of us who are doing masters, it's just one project that we're doing. So you've got a lot of different things going on.
Yeah, I have a lot of different things. These two things were actually part of my master's, so I did both those for my master's, and then I stuck around for a PhD because I wanted a PhD, but I also wanted to look at these effects long term, and you don't get that option as a master's, and you rarely do the same work as a master's and a PhD to have a long-term data set. So I stayed on to do that, and I added other things to that for my PhD work.
So what else did you add?
So right now I'm looking at community composition changes, bird species specifically. So we know a lot about how a lot of birds like bison being present, grazing being present, and some don't. So I have acoustic recorders out at my sites listening to the birds that are present, so I can focus on the other two things I just said, looking for the nest and putting out artificial nests. So I have them recording. The best thing about recorders, even though you can't see the birds, they can be set to record at the exact same time at all the sites. So I'm looking at the same time frame which is the best, I think.
So that the alternative to using the microphones would of course be to have you walking and birding through each site,
Yes.
which means you couldn't do all of them at the same time.
I could not do them on the same time or on the same day, so that could be different birds heard or not at these certain sites. I would have the visual, which would help. Might be missing ones that are just hearing instead of just seeing and hearing, but it's best to do all of them at the same time.
Interesting.
So I get to listen to all of those recordings
Yes.
later on and identify the species to see if there are different species with the bison being grazing and without bison grazing.
Sure. Nice. And I know that you just took your candidacy exams, right?
Yes.
So I think you're the first person who's done this interview sort of like right after that. So can you explain to us what the candidacy exam is, how that works, why you have to do it?
So for a PhD student, a candidacy exam or a qualifying exam is basically a checkpoint to make sure you're on the right track, both for your research and the knowledge that you've learned so far. You can equate it kind of to a master's defense, it's sort of a mini master's defense, to where depending on the institution you're at least here at NIU, in our department specifically, they have a different sort of rules. I had to write a grant, a doctoral dissertation grant, DDIG. I don't remember the rest of the acronym. It doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, but I had to write one of those, and my committee would go over it, tell me what I did wrong or not. The best thing about this grant is that it's not only the research you're doing or the research you propose to do, but you had to add a separate part that was only semi-related. So different one thinking about different questions or a different aspect of what you might want to do. And part of that is actually now. A qualifying exam or a candidacy exam is that checkpoint. Again, a master's defense checkpoint almost, where I had to write a grant, a dissertation, I don't even remember, the DDIG grant. And again, that was a good thing because of you not only write about your research, what you proposed and what you found so far, but you also add a separate part in it. And that separate part for me was about migration stuff. And I'm actually using that as part of my dissertation now. So it ends up being a fourth component in that. But besides having this grant that they have to look at and think that it's good, I also had to give a presentation to them about all of that together. So that was one big component, and the presentation and the grant couldn't be looked at ahead of time by anyone, a grad student or a faculty member or anyone.
So not even your advisor?
Not even my advisor knew what I was about to propose to them. It was all just off the cuff from what I've looked at and what I've found.
Wow.
So it's a crazy experience, at least in that aspect, because you're used to having your advisor look over the things that you turn in. So I didn't have any of that, and these qualifying exams and candidacy exams are widely different between different institutions and different departments, but this is just how we're doing it. So after I gave that presentation, my committee sort of asked me questions about the grant as well as other aspects. So it really was like a mini or a master's defense, just without that public portion.
So you're doing a demonstration of, this is my understanding of how the stats work, this is my understanding of all of the background information, this is my justification for my hypotheses that I'm presenting.
Yes, both of what you've been doing and this added portion,
Sure.
yeah.
Interesting. Okay. And then of course there's the whole they send you out of the room and deliberate thing.
Yes. And a lot of times I think they just talk about random things and not about actually deliberating about it. So yeah, they send you out of the room and you have to wait until they all approve or not approve or however that goes. So.
But I guess what you're getting at here is that like if you've gotten to that point, they're probably not going to say no.
Yes, if you've gotten to that point and you have a really good advisor that's not going to let you do a candidacy exam without knowing that you're able
Sure.
to do a candidacy exam, that's the best part. At least in my case, you can ask your committee members what they plan on asking you. So I was able to go over things and make sure at least I knew generally what they wanted to know.
Okay, nice. All right. So you said that you started with your master's and then you knew you wanted to get a doctorate. So can you sort of go back in time and explain to us why did you want to become a scientist, and why did you want to go to grad school, and why specifically get a doctorate?
So that kind of harkens back to the beginning of undergraduate.
Okay.
So I actually applied to my undergraduate institution as a business major.
Oh.
I did not actually start out thinking I wanted to do science at all.
Okay.
And I was just kind of confused. It was one of those, oh, business sounds good because, you know, not having a major probably sounds pretty bad too at that time. But right before classes started, I decided, you know what, I really like being outdoors. I like biology, I like ecology. I'm going to do biology as my undergraduate major. So I'm really glad that happened, that sort of spark in my brain as I realized business wasn't that great for me at the time. It was just sort of something I put down when I applied. But luckily I was still accepted even though I changed the major, and that's kind of where that began, sort of that train of, hey, this is what I really like to do. I'm going to get more in depth of it. I was able to do research as an undergrad, and that research is published right now, looking at how birds are being impacted or not impacted by an invasive shrub species, autumn olive.
Sure.
Yeah, so we did a lot of mist netting, and I listened to birds, and I watched them at feeders to see if there was any differences between autumn olive and other native shrubs. So that's sort of my whole part of that, and that's where I got into birds specifically. During that time, I was like, well, I think I need or want, not just need, but want and need a graduate degree to sort of go on learning about ecology and biology and doing all of that. And I really wanted to get a doctorate, just for not just for my own sake, but I was the first one in my family, first member of my family to go to any college whatsoever. And then I wanted to sort of keep continuing with that education and get a PhD. So I applied to a bunch of labs outright after I graduated, going into a PhD program in a different sort of discipline. I wanted to look at coastal ecology and how invasive species were sort of affecting our coast and other species. And I was rejected from all of those that I did apply, and I understand why, especially now, because I didn't have any like training in that specific field, system, and I wanted to go straight to PhD with that, and it just didn't work out. But I was lucky after that to take sort of a year off, and I was a stewardship technician, meaning I was cutting down all of these invasive species, burning prairies, that kind of thing.
It's very cathartic.
It is really nice, and I liked it a lot to do that. And so I sort of like went through, what do I really want to do? And I do like invasive species interactions and how they impact native species, and just restoration in general. And so after that, I applied to master's positions with labs that looked at invasive species as also restoration techniques. So that's how I'm here.
And that's how you found Holly and wound up here.
Yep.
Great. Awesome. So where do I want to go with this? So your undergraduate research, how did you sort of fall into that? Was that a requirement, or was it something that you decided you wanted to pursue? I know that a lot of colleges do things differently when it comes to undergraduate research. So
it's a requirement, and you can start at your junior year, and I did junior and senior, and I did a lot of different work with that. Nice. And so our department was really small, so we really only had a couple ecology focused people, and I chose one that was both focused on ecology and birds. And she just started working with that invasive shrub, and that was my main focus. I didn't want to work with just bird biology. I wanted to work with sort of that ecological standpoint. So that's where we started, and I helped think about the different questions we might ask with that, seeing if birds might avoid the actual branches themselves. So we had a lot of bird feeder experiments where we stuck branches to feeders, seeing if the birds preferred a native versus the invasive shrub. We also did a lot of frugivory work, seeing if the fruits of these shrubs were taken more or less compared to other native shrubs, and if that was different. And then we started mist netting in sites that had invasive shrubs and didn't. So mist nets are giant hair nets that catch birds. So we're seeing if there were more or less birds, or if the species were different in sites that were invaded and sites that weren't.
So you were looking at straight abundance and also the composition of the community.
Yeah, and if that changed. And then later on we looked at what are these birds eating? Are they eating these invasive shrubs or not? So I set up fecal traps. I sort of built and set up fecal traps for that. And we only had one season of data before I graduated, but that actually expanded with the next students, and they did a year-round study, and she actually presented that work at the Ecological Society of America last year. So it's been pretty cool to see all of those different aspects and where they've gone.
I have to ask, how does one build a fecal trap?
It's pretty easy. So you just have to make a perch site for a bird. So it's really just a post or whatever you want sticking in the ground. We wrapped a stick around it so the bird can perch on. And then underneath we had a window screen, and underneath that we had sort of a plastic tub.
Oh,
so the feces would sort of hit on the window screen. If it rained, the urea would like wash away, but the seeds would stay, and we would collect the seeds and identify them in the lab.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Huh. So what is it like, because I think you're also the first person in this category maybe, what is it like to be the first person in your family to be going to college, and not just at all, but to be going on and getting the Uber degree?
I don't know if it's the same for other people. I get the question a lot, like, what are you going to do with this degree? My dad really wants me to make sure I make a lot of money, and that may or may not happen. And sometimes it's hard to talk to them about it, but they're usually pretty enthusiastic about what I chose, just maybe not as not necessarily welcoming, but understandable of the parts of things that I have to do as a graduate student.
Yeah, college is complicated. And
yeah.
So like so many of us here in the ecology department, you do a lot of field work.
Yes.
What are your like ideal field conditions for what you do?
For what I do? Well, first I want to start off with the fact that I didn't ever think I would work in a prairie system.
Oh.
And after my undergrad, so I did work with the invasive shrub, and it's on edge habitat, so I was working in edge habitats. It's like, oh, prairies are so hot in the middle of the day. There's a lot of ticks. I don't like it. But I've actually grown to love the prairie habitat, especially during the morning hours, which is what I work at. So my ideal field conditions would be not a lot of heat, usually not necessarily early in the morning. I do rise early, but not that early normally. So if that cooler conditions could be midday, that would be great, but that's not going to happen. So cooler conditions and dry conditions, not only from the rain, but most people don't realize that tallgrass prairie can get really wet from the dew in the morning.
The dew, oh.
And there's a few days in the summer where it's completely dry, and it's great. But that doesn't necessarily happen all the time, and I would love for it to be dry.
Yeah.
Because you have to actually wear rain gear even though it's summer and it's hot and it's not raining at all.
Yeah, I went out a few like early mornings to set up my experiments, and your pants are just like completely soaked and your shoes are squishy, and it's just not awesome.
So even when you wear like rubber boots, the water collects on your pants and rolls down into the boots, and you're just sloshing through the prairie the whole time. So I would like a cool, dry experience that is very hard.
With minimal ticks.
For minimal ticks, yes. And I've gotten fewer ticks at Nachusa than I've had in other areas, so that's
nice.
The best.
So along with all of that and saying that you didn't think you were going to work in the prairie, is there something about the system that you're working in, or something about the sort of work that you're doing that you see as like a frustration or a necessary evil, or the thing that's your least favorite about what you're doing?
Least favorite, trudging through the tallgrass prairie. It's harder to get through than a forested system,
yes.
But I've grown to love it. It's a lot more dynamic than I ever thought it was, so I've gotten used to it. I really like right after a burn. It's really great.
The burn sites are much better than the unburned sites.
At least in the beginning.
Yes. And on the opposite, what is like your absolute favorite thing about what you're doing for your research?
I think that my most favorite and the most rewarding is following the real nest through time. So I'm able to watch a nest being built for the most part, the eggs laid. I can see them hatching sometimes, so when I check them every few days, I actually have seen hatching occur, which is super cool. And then you just watch them as they grow up as chicks and then leave the nest. And it's a super rewarding experience. Not just collecting data for my research, I actually feel really awesome.
So you're invested in the babies that you're watching grow up. Yeah. Do you band or otherwise like mark to identify the chicks?
So no, I don't do any of that. And so we did banding as an undergrad, and it's great. But in terms of this, I wanted to minimize my disturbance as much as possible. I didn't want my presence there influencing whether or not they were successful or not. So touching them, banding them, I spend very minimal time there. We use GPS units to mark the nest instead of flags like most people do, and I understand why now, because GPSs aren't as accurate as we hoped they were. So a lot of people would flag farther away from the nest and take down coordinates of where it was, which helps re-find it, but it also does help cue in avian predation, so I am making sure I'm as minimal as possible.
Yeah, I imagine that would be, you said avian predation, but especially like the crows, right? They're smart.
They're
probably
very smart. They would know. Yeah.
Interesting. Huh. So you have, you're part of a very big lab with a whole bunch of people. So some other interviewees have talked a lot about people skills. What do you think are the sorts of people skills you might have already had or things you've had to develop in working in this lab that's full of other grad students and undergrads and stuff like that?
So as an undergrad, I think I had very minimal people skills maybe, but I've learned to sort of get used to talking about my research and just talking in general, where just talking to a group of people about my work when I was an undergrad would make me not eat that whole day because I was afraid I was going to throw up. So after that, and then being in the lab with a lot of people and having to talk to people, I've gotten much more comfortable with that and being able to collaborate with people. And especially recently now, there's so many of us out there at the same time, logistics-wise, and helping other people with their project, which is great.
Nice. So you say that you've gotten better at talking about your research, so you have attended a few conferences.
Yes.
Do you prefer to do a talk or a poster at a conference, and why?
So I think you should pick one or the other, and it really depends on where you are in your research. So a poster is really good if you're sort of just starting, you don't have a lot to say in a talk, but I like posters when the conference is closer. It's a lot easier to manage than if you have to fly there. So if you can avoid flying with a poster, I would suggest that as much as possible. Unfortunately, in this university, I don't think we are able to print on fabric, but there are fabric printers where you can just fold it up in your luggage.
Yeah, those are cool.
And it's really cool, and I wish we could do it more often for people who need to do posters. Those are nice because you get a lot of different interest. Most of the time at that conference, they don't have conflicting presentations during the poster session, so as many people there can come there and you can talk about your research. I find it kind of awkward, and I'm still kind of awkward in my people skills about engaging people in conversation. I'd be very more one-sided about it. I'll just stand there and wait for them to have questions and try to ask them if they want me to, and I feel like I'm imposing myself on them, thinking about what to ask, so I try not to. So that's the part I don't like about posters. I do like giving presentations. Usually the people there are people who want to see their talk. You get a wide variety of those people, and you can have more one-on-one question and answers, so everyone can hear one question being asked so they don't repeat that, and you're not repeating yourself for a 2-hour poster session. Just another thing I don't like about it. You have to stand there for 2 hours, unlike just giving a presentation, you only have to be there for 15 minutes.
And you are still, like all of us, that's the point of this series, is that we're all early career scientists. So what do you think is like the number one thing you've set as like a goal for yourself that you need to work on to improve as a researcher?
I think communication, just that one-sided conversation, engaging people in conversation, that'll help sort of increase collaborations in the future, because collaborations are a big thing in research. You can't just do everything yourself. Even I've tried and it doesn't work.
Okay, so you want to get better at just like starting conversations with people so that you can make connections
and collaborations and that kind of stuff.
Nice. Yeah. And on the reverse, what do you think is one of your personal qualities that makes you a really good researcher?
Probably the exact opposite of that, which is trying to do things myself, make sure that everything is where it needs to be, so there's not a lot of variation, kind of controlling in a way, but it really helps make things flow a lot easier, I think.
That's a good answer. Yeah, organization.
Yeah.
And the last question, which sounds cheesy, but we care. So what is next for you after this?
So I was asked that question yesterday, because I was giving a talk about my research yesterday, and my response is, good question. I have a broad goal of not wanting to be in academia after this. Like, I've taught a lot, and I don't really want to go that role. There's a lot more things to balance, including teaching and research and a lot of things. I want to work for the Nature Conservancy or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, working in a ecologist position, looking at different things myself, but also helping other people out there. I want to help them do their research, that kind of stuff.
So less focused on teaching, but more focused on application of science. Interesting. Great. Well, I wish you the best of luck with that. I think you're going to be great at it, because
I hope so.
those are fun jobs. And so we thank Heather again for speaking with us. This was a super fun interview. I love
Thank you for having me.
If you liked this video, don't forget to like it. If you didn't like this video, please share it with someone who would. And if you'd like to support the Roving Naturalist, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon. You can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and read science posts on my blog. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.